The guy who offered me everything in his storage unit if I helped him move turned out to be robbing a family I'd never met. When I asked him why he picked me, he laughed and said, "You look like the kind of person nobody believes." I just stood there. That was 11 months ago. This morning, he was standing outside my building in the rain. When did doing someone a favor go horribly wrong? When I was between jobs last fall, this guy Trent knocked on my apartment door and offered me the contents of an entire storage unit if I helped him empty it that afternoon. I almost laughed in his face until he showed me photos on his phone of vintage guitars, antique furniture, and boxes of what looked like gold jewelry. "There's a lot of junk in there too. I'm not gonna lie to you," he said, "but whatever you want is yours if you help me out here." Trent explained he was flying to Portugal in 6 hours for a job he couldn't pass up, and his storage unit needed to be cleared out today, or he'd owe another year of fees. He looked exhausted and desperate, showing me his plane ticket and explaining how the moving company had bailed on him that morning. The unit was paid through midnight, and everything inside was mine to keep or sell if I could just help him meet the deadline. My electricity was getting shut off the next day, and I'd been eating ramen for 2 weeks straight, so I borrowed my neighbor's pickup truck and told Trent he had himself a deal. The storage facility was one of those massive places with endless rows of identical orange doors. Trent had the biggest unit at the very back corner, practically a garage, and when he rolled up that metal door, my jaw dropped. This wasn't someone's forgotten junk, but an entire life carefully packed in labeled boxes. There were leather couches that looked brand new, a grandfather clock that probably cost more than my car, and guitar cases that made my musician heart race. Trent stood there checking his phone every 2 minutes while telling me his ex had left him all this stuff in the divorce, and he just wanted to start fresh. He helped me load the first few boxes, but kept apologizing that he had to leave for the airport soon. After 20 minutes, Trent handed me the unit key. "You're saving my life here," he said, shaking my hand with both of his. "Take whatever you want, and thanks for not making me deal with her stuff anymore." He practically ran to his car and peeled out of the parking lot while I stood there looking at my lottery ticket of abandoned treasures. I spent the next 3 hours in heaven carefully loading that truck. Every box revealed something incredible, like first edition books, pristine vinyl records, or expensive kitchen appliances still in their packaging. There was a whole wardrobe of designer clothing with tags still on, boxes of collectible coins, and enough tools to stock a hardware store. My apartment was furnished with milk crates and a mattress on the floor, but after today, I'd be living like an actual adult. The vintage Gibson acoustic alone would pay my rent for 6 months once I sold it, as much as that would feel like selling a kidney. But then I found the filing cabinet tucked behind a stack of paintings. Inside were mortgage documents, tax returns, and insurance paperwork all organized in color-coded folders. My stomach felt weird when I saw the name at the top wasn't Trent, anything but belonged to somebody named Dr. Nathaniel Berger. I thought maybe Trent was his middle name, or this was his ex-wife's maiden name from before they met. Rich people did weird things with their names all the time, but then I opened a box labeled Family Memories 1995 to 2010, and my hands started shaking. Every single photo showed a middle-aged black couple with their 2 kids at birthday parties, graduations, and Christmas mornings. The man in the photos certainly seemed to be Dr. Nathaniel Berger based on the medical degree hanging in the background, but Trent was a 20-something white guy with neck tattoos who looked nothing like anyone in these pictures. I grabbed another box desperately hoping to find something that made sense, but it was full of baby shoes and kindergarten report cards for kids named Madison and Mason Berger. There was a Father's Day card that said, "World's Best Dad," with a photo of Dr. Berger teaching his son to ride a bike. My chest felt tight as I realized Trent had never owned any of this stuff, had never been married to anyone in these photos, had probably never even met the Berger family. He was just robbing them, or setting me up to rob them, and I had no idea why. He'd somehow gotten access to this storage unit and needed someone else's fingerprints all over everything when the real owners discovered their stuff was gone. Trent was probably already at the airport heading anywhere but Portugal. But why me? Why was this guy I'd never met trying to ruin my life? What was in it for him? That's when I heard the sirens. The sirens got louder, and I stood there like an idiot with those family photos shaking in my hands, watching 2 police cars pull into the storage facility and block the only way out. My legs felt like they were made of cement, and even though my brain was screaming at me to run or explain or do something, I couldn't move a single muscle. Officer Lucas Thompson got out first with his hand already on his gun, walking toward me real slow and telling me to step away from the truck and keep my hands where he could see them. The photos scattered all over the concrete when I dropped them and raised my shaking hands up high. "This isn't what it looks like," I said, but Officer just kept walking closer while his partner called for backup on the radio. Detective Angela Rivera showed up about 5 minutes later in an unmarked car and started taking pictures of everything while Officer patted me down for weapons. I tried explaining about Trent and the job offer and pulled out the storage unit key he'd given me, but Detective just looked at me like I was trying to sell her a bridge while she photographed every single thing I'd loaded in that truck. That's when Dr. Nathaniel Berger's car pulled up and he got out with his teenage daughter Madison, both of them looking at their stuff piled in Carlos's truck like they were seeing a ghost. Madison started crying when she spotted her mom's jewelry boxes just thrown in the truck bed all careless, and Dr. Berger demanded they arrest me right now for stealing everything his family owned. I showed Detective the text messages from Trent on my phone, but the number was already disconnected when she tried calling it. I described him the best I could. White guy in his 20s with neck tattoos driving a blue Honda Civic, and Detective wrote it all down in her little notebook, but then explained that I was still the one caught red-handed with stolen property no matter what story I told. Officer put the handcuffs on me while the Bergers started carefully unloading their family photos from the truck, and Madison found a box of her kindergarten art projects and just completely lost it, sobbing into her dad's shoulder. Standing there in handcuffs watching this family pick through their whole life that I'd been loading up like it was mine made me realize exactly how deep Trent had buried me in this mess. They took me to the police station downtown where they booked me for felony theft and burglary, taking my fingerprints that were already all over the storage unit door and every single box and the truck too. The judge on the video screen set my bail at $50,000, which was basically the same as $1 million considering I couldn't even pay my electric bill. They gave me one phone call, and I used it to reach my sister Rachel Moore, who was in the middle of a custody hearing at family court. "Don't say anything else to anyone," she told me before promising to come as soon as she could get away. The holding cell had 3 other guys in it who all looked at me like they were trying to figure out if I was worth messing with or not. The fluorescent lights buzzed so loud it made my head hurt, and I sat there on that metal bench going over every single thing Trent had said to me, looking for some warning sign I should have caught. My electricity was definitely getting shut off tomorrow, and that seemed like the least of my problems now. Rachel showed up 6 hours later looking exhausted from her court case, but ready to fight for me anyway. She looked through all the charges and started asking questions about stuff that didn't make sense, like how did Trent get a legitimate key to the storage unit, and why hadn't anybody looked at the security footage from the facility yet. We're going to figure this out, she said, but I could tell from her face that she knew this was bad, really bad, and we both knew I didn't have the money for a real defense. The next morning, Carlos showed up at the jail looking mad as hell, and I couldn't blame him since his truck was sitting in some police lot. He kept pacing back and forth while I tried to explain through the thick glass how this guy had played me perfectly. His face went from angry to confused when I told him about the photos and the storage unit full of someone else's life. Carlos needed that truck for his construction job and said if he couldn't work Monday, he'd lose everything. Meanwhile, Detective Rivera was pulling security footage from the storage place and found something that made her sit up straight. She showed me grainy video of Trent going to that same unit 5 different times over the past month, always between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. The detective started making calls and discovered those were the exact hours when Madison worked at the hospital across town. This wasn't some random thing where Trent picked me out of nowhere. Rachel showed up 3 hours later with paperwork saying she'd put her house up to get me out on bail. She kept shaking her head while signing papers and telling me I should have known better than to trust some stranger. The ride back to my apartment was quiet until we got there and found the electricity had been cut off just like the notice said. I used my phone's flashlight to throw clothes in a bag while Rachel stood in the doorway saying I could stay with her. That same afternoon, Madison posted about the theft on Facebook with my full name and the photo from my arrest. Within an hour, my phone was blowing up with messages from people I'd never met calling me every name you could think of. I'm really curious about how Trent picked this exact storage unit. Did he somehow know Dr. Berger's schedule, or was he watching the family? 3 of my guitar students texted to cancel their lessons, and one parent said she'd already told everyone at her church about me. Detective Rivera called the storage facility manager, who remembered something weird from 2 weeks back. Someone claiming to be Madison had called to add an authorized person to the account. The caller knew Madison's social security number, and even her mom's maiden name, which was the security question. Madison found out his mail had been disappearing for months when he went to check old statements, credit card bills, medical stuff. Even the renewal notice for the storage unit never made it to his mailbox. Someone had been taking everything with his name on it and building up enough information to steal his whole identity. Rachel found a lawyer named David Park, who said he'd take my case for free if it went to trial. He believed my story and started digging into similar scams in other cities. Within 2 days, he'd found 3 cases in Phoenix where guys got tricked the exact same way by different people calling themselves Trent. I couldn't sleep at Rachel's place and kept checking my phone every 5 minutes for news. Every car that drove by made me wonder if Trent was out there watching and laughing at how perfectly he'd set me up. The detective kept working the case and pulled security footage from my apartment building. She got clear shots of Trent at my door the day he knocked, but when she ran his face through the system, nothing came up. Trent Morrison didn't exist in any database, which meant that wasn't even his real name. Then Carlos called me panicking because someone had broken into his truck at the impound lot. They didn't take the truck, but they got his registration and insurance papers from the glove box. Now whoever was behind this knew where Carlos lived too, and he was yelling at me to fix this right now. My public defender called me the next morning while I was making instant coffee and told me to come to her office right away. Attorney Park had papers spread across her entire desk when I walked in, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She showed me printouts from cases in Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico where someone matching Trent's description had pulled the exact same scam. Each time he found someone posting online about money troubles and offered them a storage unit full of valuables. 2 guys were sitting in prison right now because they couldn't prove they weren't the masterminds. Park said this proved a pattern, but we still needed more evidence to show I was just another victim. Rachel insisted I should meet with Madison to apologize in person, even though the idea made my stomach hurt. We met at a coffee shop downtown 3 days later, and Madison sat across from me with his arms crossed. I explained how I was about to lose my apartment, and my electricity was getting cut off when Trent showed up. Madison just stared at me and said my problems weren't his problem before walking out. That same week, Madison started getting emails from someone claiming they had his mother's jewelry from the storage unit. The person wanted $5,000 or they'd destroy everything. Detective Rivera traced the emails to a coffee shop's Wi-Fi, but whoever sent them used a VPN to hide their real location. 4 nights later, I couldn't sleep and looked out Rachel's window at 2 in the morning. A blue Honda just like Trent's was parked across the street with someone sitting inside watching the house. I called 911, but the car drove away before the cops showed up. There was a cigarette butt still smoking by our mailbox that wasn't there before. The district attorney's office called a week after my arrest with an offer. If I pleaded guilty to misdemeanor theft and agreed to testify against Trent when they caught him, I'd get 2 years probation. Rachel told me not to take it because she believed we could prove I was innocent if we kept digging. Then Detective Rivera found something huge. Someone had used Madison's personal information to open 3 credit cards a month ago and maxed them all out on electronics and gift cards. The purchases started 2 weeks before I ever met Trent, which meant whoever was behind this had been planning it for a while. Rachel discovered the storage facility employee who took the phone call adding Trent as an authorized user had quit the day after the theft. His forwarding address was fake, and his entire employment application was full of made-up information. Meanwhile, I was running out of money fast. I applied for 20 jobs in 3 days, but every single background check showed my pending felony charges. Nobody would even call me back for an interview. My savings account had $47 left, and Rachel was buying my groceries. Then Carlos called me in a panic because someone broke into his house while he was at work. They didn't take anything valuable, but went through all his papers and took photos of his family pictures on the walls. His wife was crying and saying this was all my fault for getting them involved. My public defender's investigator found something interesting when he dug deeper into the other cases. All 3 guys in other states had posted on Craigslist or Facebook about needing money within days of Trent contacting them. I remembered posting on Reddit 2 weeks before Trent knocked on my door about how I couldn't afford groceries and was about to be homeless. The investigator said Trent was hunting for desperate people online, and I'd basically painted a target on my back without knowing it. 2 weeks passed with me stuck at home wearing an ankle monitor, while Madison hired some private investigator to track down Trent. The PI called me asking questions about what Trent looked like and what name he used. Then 3 days later, he found security footage from an extended stay motel showing someone matching Trent's description checking in as Travis Mitchell. The credit card he used belonged to Madison, stolen from the storage unit paperwork, along with all her personal info. Detective Rivera got a warrant and took a whole team to raid the motel room the next morning, but when they kicked in the door, the place was already cleaned out. They found brown hair dye in the bathroom trash can and a crumpled receipt for a Greyhound bus ticket to Kansas City dated the day before. Madison showed up at my door that same afternoon without warning, standing there with her arms crossed asking why I did this to her family. I showed her my Reddit post from before Trent knocked, the shut-off notices taped to my fridge, the empty cabinets where food should have been. She sat at my kitchen table reading through months of my posts about being broke and desperate while tears ran down her face. The forensics team called Detective Rivera, while Madison was still there to say they'd matched prints from the motel room to someone named Kyle Patterson, who'd been arrested for fraud in Nevada 3 years ago. Kyle had jumped bail and disappeared, but now they had enough to issue warrants in multiple states. My phone rang the next day, with someone claiming to be from my bank about suspicious activity on my account. I almost gave them my social security number before something felt wrong about how pushy they were being. The caller laughed when I said I was hanging up and said, "Trent says hello," before the line went dead. Rachel came over that night with her laptop and showed me something that made my stomach drop. Someone had been reading my Reddit post for months before Trent showed up, clicking on every post where I mentioned being broke, or my work schedule, or even which neighbor had a pickup truck. The IP address traced to different coffee shops around Denver, but the pattern was clear that this whole thing was planned way before that knock on my door. 3 weeks after my arrest, the landlord changed my locks and I had to move in with Rachel since I couldn't find work with pending felony charges. I spent my days helping her research Trent online, while my guitar sat in the corner gathering dust because I couldn't even look at it without thinking about that storage unit. Madison called crying one morning because someone had taken out a $50,000 loan in her name and transferred it to some offshore account before the bank even noticed. The bank was holding her responsible since whoever did it had her social security number, her mother's maiden name, and answers to all her security questions from the storage unit documents. Detective Rivera got a tip from Kansas police that someone matching Kyle or Trent's description got arrested for shoplifting, but was released on bail before they connected him to our case. He was using the name Connor Murphy now, and had already disappeared by the time they went looking for him. Carlos knocked on Rachel's door that night, shaking with rage because his wife had filed for separation and taken their kids to her mother's house in New Mexico. She'd found a GPS tracker stuck under their car and couldn't handle the fear anymore, convinced that Trent, or whoever he really was, might come after them next. Carlos shoved the separation papers in my face, screaming that this was all my fault, and he was going to sue me for destroying his family. Rachel pulled me inside and slammed the door while Carlos kept pounding on it and screaming about lawyers until the neighbors started coming out to see what was happening. The attorney Rachel had hired was already waiting in her home office with stacks of papers spread across the desk and a laptop showing court records from 3 other states. He'd been digging into similar cases all week and found something that made my stomach drop even further than it already had. Every single time this con artist struck, he came back to the same city within 60 days to collect items he'd hidden during the original theft. The pattern was so consistent across 7 different cases that the FBI had started tracking it, and if Trent followed his usual timeline, he'd be back in Denver within the month. What makes someone like Kyle Patterson pick guitar teachers and truck drivers to destroy? The way he studied those Reddit posts for months, learning every detail about when bills were due and which neighbor had a pickup. That takes such strange dedication to hurting regular people. Rachel's kids were doing homework in the living room when I finally picked up my old guitar that had been sitting in the corner untouched since this whole nightmare started. My fingers found the strings automatically, and before I knew it, I was playing the first song I'd written back in college, something soft and sad that matched exactly how I felt. Emma and Josh stopped their math problems to listen, their eyes wide because they'd never heard me play before, and for 30 minutes the music took me somewhere else entirely where storage units and criminal charges didn't exist. Madison called the next morning practically screaming into the phone because he'd found his mother's missing jewelry being sold on some sketchy online marketplace, the exact diamond necklace and matching earrings she'd worn to their anniversary dinner last year. The seller's account had been created the day after the storage unit theft, and Detective Rivera immediately set up a fake buyer profile to arrange a meeting at a coffee shop downtown. We all knew it was probably a trap, but the detective had backup units ready, and maybe we'd finally catch this guy and end this whole mess. The coffee shop meeting was set for noon, but nobody showed up except for the undercover cops who sat there drinking lattes for 2 hours while I waited in Rachel's car across the street. Then my phone buzzed with a photo that made my blood run cold because it showed Rachel's backyard taken from inside her fence, her kids' bikes visible against the garage, and a message that just said, "Stop looking or your sister's next." A month dragged by with constant meetings with lawyers and investigators until the preliminary hearing finally arrived, and I sat in that courtroom wearing the only suit I owned while the judge reviewed all the evidence. She agreed there was reasonable doubt about my guilt based on the fake identities and the pattern of similar crimes, but she wouldn't dismiss the charges completely and set the trial date for 3 months out. Madison's medical practice started falling apart because patients heard about the identity theft and worried their personal information wasn't safe anymore, forcing him to hire an expensive security firm to audit everything and prove his systems were secure. Rachel discovered something even worse when she started calling around to different storage facilities because the employee who'd quit right after the theft wasn't really named Jake Winters at all. Security footage from 3 weeks before the theft showed him meeting with Trent in the parking lot multiple times, going over facility maps and discussing something that looked pretty intense based on their body language. They'd been planning this together from the very beginning, setting me up as the perfect fall guy who desperately needed money and would jump at any opportunity. I was loading groceries into Rachel's car at the King Soopers on Colorado Boulevard when two guys came up behind me and started shoving me against the trunk. They kept yelling that I'd stolen from their uncle, who turned out to be one of Madison's cousins, and Rachel's kids were watching from the back seat as these guys threw punches at my ribs. I kept my hands at my sides and didn't fight back, even though every instinct screamed at me to defend myself, because one arrest for fighting would violate my bail and send me straight to jail. Detective Rivera called that night with the DNA results from the cigarette butt they'd found outside Rachel's house, and it matched the sample they'd gotten from Kyle or Trent or whatever his real name was. She immediately increased police patrols around Rachel's neighborhood, but we all knew that wouldn't really stop someone who'd been doing this for years and clearly knew how to avoid getting caught. Madison got a storage unit bill in the mail for a facility all the way across town in Aurora, a place he'd never even been to, but somehow the unit was in his name with his forged signature on all the paperwork. Detective Rivera got a warrant within hours, and when they opened that unit, they found boxes and boxes of stolen items from at least a dozen other victims. Everything from electronics to artwork to someone's entire coin collection worth thousands of dollars. The cops took photos of everything while I sat in the back of a patrol car for the second time that month. 6 weeks crawled by with me stuck at Rachel's house wearing an ankle monitor that beeped if I walked past her mailbox. My lawyer's investigator finally tracked down this guy in Phoenix who'd been locked up for the same exact thing 2 years ago. The guy told him over the phone that Trent never worked alone and had some tech person who did all the computer stuff like making fake IDs and picking which people to target. Rachel's kids came home from school every afternoon, and I started teaching her youngest, Emma, how to play guitar just to feel useful again. She picked it up crazy fast and reminded me why I used to love music before all this mess started. It was the first time I'd smiled in weeks watching her tiny fingers find the right chords. Then Detective Rivera called about what they found when they really dug through that Aurora storage unit. There were 7 manila folders with photos and information about different people, including me. My folder had pictures of me walking to the coffee shop 6 months ago, notes about when I worked at the music store, and even recordings of my phone calls to my landlord about the late rent. Someone had been watching me for half a year before Trent showed up at my door. Madison finally agreed to meet with the prosecutor after seeing all this evidence. She told him she believed I might be innocent now, but he still wouldn't drop the charges because he needed someone to blame for her dad's missing stuff. That same week, Rachel came home from her law firm looking sick. Her senior partners had gotten a bar complaint about her harboring a criminal with photos of me living in her house. They suggested she should distance herself from me if she wanted to keep her job. The FBI took over the case after they connected our situation to similar cons in 5 other states. Agent Sarah Coleman interviewed me for 3 hours in their Denver office, going through every detail of that day with Trent. She actually believed my story and said the charges might get dropped if I helped them catch whoever was really behind this. 2 months after my arrest, I still couldn't find any work because every background check showed pending felony charges. Even the fast food places turned me down the second they ran my name. I sold my whole guitar collection to help Rachel with bills, keeping only the Martin my dad gave me before he died. The FBI traced the money from all these scams to offshore accounts connected to someone they called the architect who planned these identity theft schemes. Agent Coleman explained that Trent, whose real name was Kyle something, was just one of many collectors who carried out the plans. Carlos showed up at Rachel's house drunk one night screaming about how I'd ruined his truck's reputation. He threw a punch that Rachel's doorbell camera caught perfectly before I even had time to react. Now we both had criminal charges pending, which made everything worse. Madison started posting about my case on social media after she learned about all the evidence. Her posts went viral in Denver with hundreds of people sharing their own stories about getting scammed the same way. The comments under Madison's post got nastier every day until my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Madison's voice was quiet when she said she was sorry for what people were saying about me online. She explained how her dad had lost his whole medical practice after the storage unit thing hit the news, and she'd been so angry she wanted someone to pay. Now she realized I was just another victim like them and asked if I'd help track down the real criminals. I told her yes immediately because anything was better than sitting in my apartment watching my life fall apart. 10 weeks had passed since my arrest when Detective called with actual good news for once. Someone using Madison's stolen credit card had been caught on camera at a casino in Laughlin, and the FBI recognized him as Lucas Thompson, the guy who worked at the storage facility. The same Jake who'd supposedly been on vacation when everything went down, but who'd actually been helping Trent the whole time. They had him on camera using 3 different stolen cards from the Berger family, plus footage of him at an ATM withdrawing cash. The FBI moved fast after that. Rachel called me crying the next morning because her law firm had put her on administrative leave while the state bar investigated her for representing me. They said she'd created a conflict of interest by taking my case when she knew I might be guilty. Her mortgage was due in 5 days, and she'd spent all her savings on my bail and legal fees. I felt sick knowing my mess had destroyed her career too. 2 days later, Jake got arrested trying to cross back into California from Nevada. Detectives said he started talking before they even got him to the station. Jake told them everything about how Trent's real name was Kyle Morrison, and he'd been hiding in Denver this whole time using the name Ryan Torres. Kyle had been watching the news coverage and laughing about how the cops couldn't find him when he was living 20 minutes from the courthouse. Jake gave them an address for an apartment complex off Colorado Boulevard, where Kyle had been staying with some woman who helped run their whole operation. Meanwhile, Carlos's wife Maria came back from visiting her sister in New Mexico and found something on their doorbell camera from 3 months ago. The footage showed Trent putting something under their truck while Carlos was at work. Maria drove straight to the police station with the video on her phone, showing Trent's face clear as day planting that GPS tracker. The way Jake spilled everything about Kyle Morrison using fake names while living 20 minutes from the courthouse makes me wonder how many other people are walking around Denver with completely made-up identities right now. Detective added it to the pile of evidence that kept growing against the real criminals. Madison suggested I go to a support group for identity theft victims that met at a community center downtown. I sat in a circle with 12 other people listening to their stories about destroyed credit and lost homes and jail time for crimes they didn't commit. One woman had been fighting fraud charges for 3 years and lost custody of her kids. Another guy spent 6 months in prison before they caught the real thief. Hearing their stories made me realize how close I'd come to losing everything forever. The FBI raid happened 3 days later at an apartment building in downtown Denver. They expected to find Kyle, but instead found a woman named Lisa Smith surrounded by computers and boxes of fake IDs. Lisa had been running the technical side of their operation for 2 years, creating false identities and hacking into databases to find storage units to rob. The FBI found files on her computer with information on over 200 victims across 5 states. Lisa tried to play tough for about an hour before her lawyer convinced her to make a deal. She told them Kyle wasn't really hiding at all, but staying with his girlfriend Michelle in Aurora. Lisa gave them the exact address and said Kyle kept a gun in the apartment and wouldn't go down without a fight. She also mentioned Kyle had been planning to leave for Mexico in 2 days, using a fake passport she'd made for him. The arrest team showed up at Michelle's apartment at 5 in the morning, expecting Kyle to be asleep. Instead, he was in the bathroom when they broke down the door and managed to squeeze through a tiny window before anyone could grab him. He dropped 2 stories onto a parked car and took off running in his boxers and a t-shirt. Kyle carjacked an old Honda at a red light 3 blocks away, and suddenly every cop in Denver was looking for him. The police called to warn me that Kyle was on the run and might come after me since I was the main witness. They parked a patrol car outside Rachel's house where I was staying and told me not to go anywhere alone. For 2 days, I jumped at every sound while Kyle's face was all over the news. Madison wrote a long letter to the district attorney explaining how the evidence proved I was just as much a victim as her family was. She included all the files detective had gathered showing how Trent or Kyle or whatever his name was had set me up from the beginning. The DA's office said they'd consider dropping the charges after Kyle was caught and could be questioned about his role in framing me. 3 weeks passed with no sign of Kyle anywhere in the country. I was staying at Rachel's house in Highlands Ranch since my apartment wasn't safe anymore. She'd taken time off work to help me deal with the legal mess, but had to go back to the office that Monday morning. I was sitting on her couch watching the news when someone knocked on the door around noon. Through the peephole, I saw a delivery guy holding a clipboard and a small package. Something felt wrong about how he kept his head down and wouldn't look directly at the door. When I opened it with the chain still on, Kyle pushed his way inside and slammed me against the wall. He looked different with shorter hair and clean-shaven face, but those cold eyes were exactly the same. He grabbed my shirt and shoved me into the living room while pulling something from his jacket pocket. It was a thick folder full of papers that he threw on the coffee table. $50,000 or I destroy your sister's career, he said while blocking the path to the front door. The papers showed fake emails between Rachel and some drug dealer, doctored photos of her at parties she'd never been to, and bank records that looked real enough to fool anyone. My phone was in my pocket, and I slowly reached for it while pretending to look through the documents. Kyle kept talking about how he'd picked me specifically because I looked desperate enough to take any sketchy job without asking questions. He said he'd watched me for weeks at the coffee shop where I played guitar on Tuesday nights. The storage unit scam was supposed to be simple, but I'd ruined everything by actually calling the cops instead of just running away. I hit record on my phone while keeping it in my pocket and asked him why he didn't just disappear instead of coming here. He laughed and said the FBI had frozen all his accounts, so he needed cash to get out of the country. Kyle admitted he and his girlfriend Lisa had been doing this for years, finding broke people to frame for their thefts. They'd stolen from over 30 families, and I was just supposed to be another patsy who'd take the fall. He said the burgers were their biggest score yet, with almost $200,000 in valuables from that unit. Kyle was getting more aggressive, pushing me back toward the kitchen while demanding I call Rachel to get the money. That's when I heard her car pull into the driveway earlier than expected. Kyle's face went white as he realized he was trapped. Rachel walked through the front door calling my name and froze when she saw Kyle standing in her living room. She immediately pulled out her phone and dialed 911 while Kyle tried to push past her to the door. I grabbed him from behind and we crashed through the screen door onto the front lawn. Kyle threw punches and tried to break free, but I held on tight while Rachel screamed our address to the dispatcher. The neighbors came outside to see what was happening, and Kyle kept struggling to get away. Within minutes, 3 police cars pulled up and officers pulled us apart. Kyle tried to claim I'd attacked him, but I pulled out my phone with the recording still running. The officers listened to Kyle admitting to everything while Rachel showed them the fake documents he'd brought. They arrested Kyle right there on her lawn, reading him his rights while the whole neighborhood watched. At the station, Detective Rivera couldn't believe Kyle had been stupid enough to show up and threaten us. The recording was perfect evidence, and the FBI agents who showed up were thrilled to finally have him in custody. Kyle's bail was set at $500,000 cash, only because of the flight risk and multiple state charges. Over the next few weeks, the FBI uncovered the full scope of what Kyle and Lisa had done. They'd stolen over $2 million from families across 7 states over the past 5 years. Each victim was carefully chosen, always someone struggling financially who could be easily framed. The FBI found detailed notes about each target in Lisa's apartment, including surveillance photos and background research. I was victim number 27 on their list with notes about my money problems and how I'd be perfect to frame. 12 weeks after Kyle's arrest, someone knocked on Rachel's door while I was making lunch. Through the window, I saw Carlos standing on the porch looking uncomfortable. Rachel let him in, and he stood in the hallway not making eye contact with me. His wife had convinced him we were both victims of Kyle's manipulation, and he wanted to apologize for hitting me. We shook hands, but both knew things would never be the same between us. The friendship was broken beyond repair, even if we could be polite to each other. 2 days later, I sat in the courtroom as the DA officially dropped all charges against me. Madison was there with her father, and Rachel sat beside me holding my hand. The judge read the dismissal order and said my record would be completely expunged within 30 days. I started crying right there in the courtroom from pure relief. My lawyer said it was the fastest dismissal she'd ever seen once the FBI provided all their evidence. Rachel got good news the next week when the Bar Association dismissed the complaint against her. The FBI had sent a letter explaining how she was protecting a crime victim, not harboring a criminal. Her law firm felt so bad about suspending her that they offered her junior partner as an apology. She accepted, but said the whole experience had changed how she saw the legal system. Even with Kyle in jail and the charges dropped, I couldn't shake the paranoia that followed me everywhere. Every knock on the door made my heart race, and I'd check the peephole 3 times before opening it. Strange cars parked on the street made me nervous and I started having nightmares about being arrested again. Rachel convinced me to start seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma from false accusations. The therapist said it would take time to feel safe again after being hunted and framed for something I didn't do. 3 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse as the star witness in Kyle's trial. He was facing 40 years for identity theft, fraud, extortion, and running a criminal enterprise across state lines. I took the witness stand and calmly told the jury exactly how he'd manipulated me from that first knock on my door. Kyle stared at me with pure hatred the entire time I testified, but I didn't look away. The prosecutor asked me to describe finding the Berger family photos and realizing I'd been set up. I explained the sick feeling of discovering those documents and knowing Kyle had orchestrated everything to destroy my life. Kyle's lawyer stood up and walked toward me with this fake smile on his face. He started asking if I'd been behind on rent, and I said yes. He asked if my power was about to be shut off, and I said yes to that too. He pulled out papers showing I'd been unemployed for 3 months before meeting Kyle. Then he asked if I'd kept loading the truck even after seeing the first few valuable items. I stayed calm and reminded him about the recording where Kyle admitted he picked me because I was desperate. The lawyer's face got red, but he kept pushing, asking why I didn't call the police right away if I was so innocent. I explained that I thought everything was legal until I found those family photos and documents. How did Kyle know exactly when Rachel would be at work and that I'd be alone at her house? The way he studied every detail about his victims for months is so strange. Watching me play guitar, tracking my money problems, even knowing which coffee shop I went to on Tuesdays. The judge finally told the lawyer to move on when he kept asking the same questions different ways. 4 months had passed since Kyle's arrest when Madison took the stand next. She talked about getting that call from the police saying they'd found her family's stuff in some stranger's truck. Her voice shook when she described seeing their Christmas ornaments and photo albums spread out in the evidence room. She had to pause when she talked about her dad's medical degree being found crumpled in a box. Several jurors wiped their eyes when she explained how violated they felt, knowing someone had gone through their dead mother's jewelry. The prosecutor showed pictures of all the family items that had been recovered. Madison identified each piece while tears ran down her face. Then Lisa Williams took the stand in her orange jumpsuit and chains. She looked different from her booking photo, thinner and older somehow. The prosecutor asked her about the scheme and she spilled everything. She told the jury how she and Kyle had spent months looking for the perfect victims online. They searched social media for people posting about money problems and being alone. They'd found my post about selling my guitar to pay rent and knew I was perfect. Lisa explained how Kyle would scout the storage facilities while she researched the owners. They'd done this 12 times before, but I was the first one who got caught. The prosecutor asked why she was testifying, and she said she wanted a reduced sentence. Kyle kept shaking his head and whispering to his lawyer the whole time she talked. When it was Madison's turn to talk about the damage, she brought receipts and bank statements. Her family had dealt with over $100,000 in fake charges on her dad's accounts. She explained how the criminals had used her dad's information to open new credit cards and loans. The banks took months to fix everything while her family's credit was destroyed. She talked about missing her brother's college tuition payment because their accounts were frozen. The insurance company had refused to pay at first, saying the family had given someone access. Her dad had spent hundreds of hours on the phone trying to fix everything. The jury went to deliberate after 3 days of testimony and evidence. They only took 3 hours to come back with their verdict. The judge asked Kyle to stand while the jury foreman read the decision. Guilty on all counts including identity theft, conspiracy, and fraud. Kyle didn't react at all, just stared straight ahead like he expected it. His lawyer asked for the verdict to be set aside, but the judge denied it immediately. The prosecutor said Kyle was facing 25 years based on the federal charges. During the sentencing preparation, investigators kept finding more victims who'd never reported anything. They found 12 more people Kyle and Lisa had scammed the same way. Some were too embarrassed to come forward, and others thought the police wouldn't believe them. One man had lost his house after Kyle destroyed his credit. Another guy lost custody of his kids when he got arrested for the theft Kyle framed him for. The judge ordered reports on all these victims for the sentencing hearing. I met with 5 of the other victims at the prosecutor's office one afternoon. We sat around this big conference table sharing our stories. The man who lost his house still lived in his car 6 months later. The father who lost his kids only got supervised visits now. One woman's husband had left her, thinking she was really a thief. Another victim had tried to kill himself after being arrested at his job. I realized how lucky I was that Detective Rivera had believed me. These people's lives were completely destroyed while I just had a bad few months. 6 months after the arrest, we all packed the courtroom for Kyle's sentencing. The judge had read all the victim impact statements and looked angry. She called Kyle a predator who destroyed innocent lives for money. Kyle finally got to speak and said we were all liars who wanted someone to blame. The judge sentenced him to 18 years in federal prison with no chance of parole. As the guards led him away, Kyle turned to me and said, "This wasn't over." The federal marshals wrote down his threat and said they'd be watching him. Lisa got sentenced next, and the judge gave her 5 years with possible parole in 2. She turned to all of us victims and apologized, saying Kyle had manipulated her too. Nobody believed her, but at least she'd helped convict him by testifying. The prosecutor said she'd probably serve the full 5 years anyway. After everything was over, the storage facility's insurance company finally agreed to pay Dr. Berger for the attempted theft. Madison called me a week later with surprising news. Her dad wanted to give me $10,000 as an apology for all the trouble. I tried to refuse, but Madison said her dad insisted since I'd been falsely accused and harassed. The money hit my bank account 3 days later, and I immediately put half toward renting a small space downtown for music lessons. I printed flyers at the library and posted them around coffee shops, then bought a decent acoustic guitar from a pawn shop since I couldn't bring myself to play anything that reminded me of that storage unit. Madison called 2 weeks later asking if I'd teach her guitar, which felt weird considering everything that had happened. She showed up for her first lesson carrying a brand new Yamaha, and we spent most of the hour not making eye contact while I showed her basic chords. By the 3rd lesson, we were actually talking about music, instead of pretending we hadn't met during the worst week of both our lives. Rachel got promoted to partner at her firm that same month, and when she found out I was still sleeping sleeping on a friend's couch, she practically dragged me back to her house. She set up the guest room with actual furniture this time and wouldn't let me argue about rent, saying we'd gotten closer through all this mess than we'd been since we were kids. Carlos invited me for dinner one night, and I went mostly because refusing felt rude after everything. His wife made enchiladas while his kids showed me their new security system, making jokes about how many cameras they had now. Carlos and I drank beers on his porch and didn't talk about what happened, but we both knew we'd never really hang out again after this. A letter arrived the next week from someone in Arizona who said Kyle had scammed them too, thanking me for being the one who finally got him caught. They included a check for $500, saying they'd gotten their settlement and wanted to pay it forward to someone else he'd hurt. 8 months after Kyle's arrest, I played my first gig at a coffee shop near my teaching studio. The place was half empty, but Rachel brought her kids, and Madison showed up with her parents, which was strange but somehow right. Detective Rivera stopped by my studio one afternoon to tell me Kyle had been attacked in prison and was now in protective custody. She said he'd probably never hurt anyone again, at least not for a very long time. I still checked my locks twice before bed and let unknown calls go to voicemail, but my therapist said that was normal after what I'd been through. The paranoia was fading, but would probably never completely disappear, just become something I managed instead of something that controlled me. A documentary filmmaker emailed me about including my story in a series on identity theft, and I agreed to do it, thinking maybe it would help someone else avoid getting caught up in something similar. Madison kept taking lessons, and by month 4, I was teaching her a song she could play for her dad's birthday. Watching her practice made me realize I'd rebuilt my life differently this time, more careful, but also more connected to people who actually mattered. 6 months into running my teaching studio, I had 12 regular students and 3 more on a waiting list. I'd mounted my father's old guitar on the wall behind my desk, not to play, but to remind myself that I'd survived losing everything else and still found my way back to music. The vintage Gibson from the storage unit was long gone as evidence, but I didn't need it anymore. My students brought their own guitars and their own stories, and I taught them chords while slowly forgetting the weight of handcuffs and the sound of sirens. Kyle was doing 5 to 7 years upstate, and I was teaching kids how to play Wonderwall badly, which felt like the right ending to the wrong story that started with a knock on my door. Man, that was a wild ride today. I had so much fun diving into this with you. Can't wait to do it all over again next time. Until then, take care and stay curious. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.